spring of 1943 arrived with a bitter surprise for the Luftwaffe. High above the English Channel, German pilots caught sight of American fighters approaching from the distance. Their immediate reaction was laughter. The aircraft drawing nearer looked nothing like the graceful Messerschmitts they commanded. These American machines appeared bulky, heavy, almost ungainly in their proportions. German pilots began mocking them across the radio net. Flying milk bottles, they called these new arrivals. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented 7,800 pounds of what seemed to be slow, awkward metal, hardly a match for German air superiority. Even Adolf Galland himself, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces, took one look and dismissed the aircraft as a lumbering beast that would fall easily to German fighters trained in the art of precision dogfighting. The Americans, he concluded, had built something that violated every principle of aerial combat that Germany understood. Too heavy, too large, too sluggish to have any chance of survival in combat. What German intelligence completely missed was the interior of each Thunderbolt. Within those bulky fuselages sat 850 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with ammunition and ready to unleash devastating firepower. Every single one of those guns could fire 850 rounds per minute. When all 8 fired together, they created a hurricane of bullets, 68 pounds of projectiles screaming through the air every minute alone. That level of firepower could saw a Messerschmitt in half or reduce a locomotive to twisted scrap metal. Lieutenant Robert Johnson felt the weight of his aircraft's controls as German fighters dove toward his squadron. The German pilots were convinced this would be an easy victory, another chance to demonstrate Luftwaffe superiority over amateur American flyers. They had no idea what they were flying toward. Inside that aircraft was a buzzsaw of metal and machinery that would transform their laughter into something far darker. The morning mist clung low over the Essex airfield as Johnson made his way down the flight line. His boots crunched against gravel between rows of massive fighters. Each Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stretched nearly 37 feet from its propeller to tail. The wingspan measured over 40 feet of American steel and aluminum. At 7,800 pounds empty weight, these aircraft dwarfed the sleek Supermarine Spitfires parked alongside them. They looked more like flying cargo trucks than fighting machines. Johnson reached out and ran his fingers along the metal skin of his assigned aircraft, feeling the cold hardness beneath his hand. The enormous nose of the Thunderbolt housed a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows produced over 2,000 horsepower when the turbocharger system reached full operation. This was revolutionary engineering. No other fighter in the world carried such a massive power plant, and certainly none could maintain full power at the altitudes where oxygen grew dangerously thin. The engine could breathe at heights where most aircraft would simply suffocate. Across the Channel in occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots were already discussing these new American arrivals. Their tone was one of barely concealed amusement. Major Wilhelm Batz had seen the intelligence photographs. He shook his head in disbelief. The Americans had apparently convinced themselves that bigger meant better, and the result was something that looked like a milk truck sprouted wings. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 weighed half as much and could turn inside any circle the lumbering Thunderbolt might attempt. The numbers seemed to prove every German conviction about American engineering philosophy. A Messerschmitt could reach 406 miles per hour in level flight. The P-47's maximum speed of 433 miles per hour only appeared at high altitude, where its turbocharger could function properly. At low level, where most dogfights actually happened, the Thunderbolt moved through the sky like a pregnant whale. But the engineers at Republic Aircraft had not designed the Thunderbolt for low-altitude knife fights. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born designer who conceived this aircraft, understood something profound about the future of air warfare. Future combat, he believed, would occur at heights where human lungs could barely function and where thin air would choke conventional engines to death. His solution was radical and bold: build the fighter around the largest, most powerful engine available. Then add a turbocharger system capable of maintaining full power up to 43,000 feet. The complexity of this system was staggering. Exhaust gases spinning a turbine that compressed incoming air before feeding it back to the engine. This maintained sea-level power at altitudes where enemy fighters began gasping for oxygen. The entire system added weight and complexity, yet it gave the Thunderbolt capabilities that no other aircraft possessed. Johnson climbed into his cockpit and examined the instrument panel before him. The bewildering array of gauges and controls monitored every aspect of the Thunderbolt's intricate systems. Manifold pressure, turbine RPM, intercooler temperature, oil pressure for both the engine and turbo unit. Every single reading was critical to keeping this massive fighter airborne. German pilots flying their simple, lightweight Messerschmitts had absolutely no conception of the technological sophistication hidden beneath the Thunderbolt's ungainly exterior. 8 Browning M2 machine guns filled the wings, 4 in each panel. The ammunition boxes were loaded with 2,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Each round weighed over 3 ounces and carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate armor plate that would stop rifle bullets without any trouble. Mixed into the ammunition were armor-piercing rounds and high-explosive rounds. A single burst from a Thunderbolt's guns could destroy any aircraft in the German inventory. The ammunition represented another advantage that German intelligence had completely overlooked. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, General Adolf Galland studied reconnaissance photographs of American airfields with mounting concern. Though not for the reasons history would later reveal, the experienced fighter ace worried these massive American aircraft might prove difficult to shoot down. Not because of their offensive capabilities, but because their sheer size suggested heavy armor that could absorb tremendous punishment. His pilots, however, remained supremely confident. German training and aircraft superiority, they believed, would ultimately prevail against any American design. Squadron Commander Major Francis Gabreski gathered his pilots around a makeshift briefing board as mechanics performed final checks on their aircraft below. The mission was straightforward and clear. Escort B-24 Liberator bombers to targets in occupied France, then engage any German fighters that rose to intercept them. None of these American pilots fully grasped what they were about to test. They carried theories of air combat that existed nowhere except in the minds of American engineers and technicians. The Thunderbolt's true advantage did not lie in speed or maneuverability. It lay in the aircraft's ability to fight effectively at altitudes where German fighters began to struggle. At 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin that exposed skin would freeze in seconds, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine continued producing full power. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs gasped for oxygen. Republican engineers had also solved the problem of high-altitude gunnery through sheer brute force. German fighters carried 1 or 2 cannon and perhaps a pair of machine guns. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50-caliber guns. This created such a dense cone of fire that precise aiming became almost irrelevant. A pilot who could simply position his aircraft in the general vicinity of an enemy fighter could rely on sheer volume of fire to achieve hits. As engines began coughing to life across the airfield, Johnson strapped himself into his parachute and adjusted his oxygen mask. The Germans were about to discover that American aircraft designers had approached the fighter problem from an entirely different philosophical direction. Where European designers sought nimble dogfighters capable of outmaneuvering opponents in close combat, Americans had built something different, a fighter that could climb higher, hit harder, and absorb more damage than anything in the sky. The Thunderbolts rolled toward the runway, their massive propellers chopping the morning air into visible spirals of condensation. Within the hour, they would cross the channel and begin teaching the Luftwaffe that assumptions about American engineering capability might prove fatally wrong. The transformation began with fuel. On January 15, 1944, the first shipments of 150-octane aviation gasoline arrived at English airfields. This marked a revolution in engine performance that German intelligence had completely failed to detect. This fuel, developed by American petroleum companies using techniques that German chemists simply could not duplicate, allowed the Thunderbolt's massive R-2800 engine to operate at manifold pressures that would have destroyed earlier power plants in seconds. Lieutenant Johnson felt the difference immediately during his first flight on the new fuel. His Thunderbolt climbed to 30,000 feet in just 12 minutes flat. That shaved nearly 3 minutes off previous performance. The engine note changed, developing a deeper, more authoritative growl as the turbocharger compressed the thin air and fed it to cylinders now capable of withstanding pressures that approached the very limits of metallurgy. Republic Aircraft had simultaneously introduced the new broad-chord propeller, manufactured by Curtiss Electric with 4 massive blades that bit deeper into the air than the original 3-blade design. The additional blade area translated directly into climb rate and acceleration. These characteristics proved decisive in the vertical combat environment above 25,000 feet, where the Thunderbolt now reigned supreme. Johnson's squadron received their first real taste of the Thunderbolt's evolved capabilities during a bomber escort mission to Schweinfurt on February 20th. Climbing through broken clouds at 28,000 feet, they encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustavs, attempting to position themselves for an attack on the B-17 flying fortresses below. The German pilots, following established Luftwaffe doctrine, initiated a diving attack from superior altitude. They were completely confident their lighter fighters would easily outmaneuver the lumbering American escorts. What happened next challenged every single assumption about air combat that Luftwaffe training had instilled. Johnson rolled his Thunderbolt into a climb, pulling back on the stick until his airspeed indicator showed 200 miles per hour in a near-vertical ascent. This should have been impossible for such a heavy aircraft. The 150-octane fuel and broad-chord propeller combination allowed the massive fighter to maintain climb performance at altitudes where Messerschmitts began struggling for power. The German flight leader, Oberleutnant Klaus Mitusch, watched in complete disbelief as the supposedly inferior American fighter climbed past his own aircraft with authority that seemed to defy physics. His Messerschmitt's DB605 engine was already straining to maintain power in the thin air. It could not match the climb rate of Johnson's supercharged Thunderbolt. Within 30 seconds, the tactical situation had reversed completely. Johnson rolled over at 32,000 feet and dove on the German formation from above. His 50-caliber guns were charged and ready. The cone of fire that erupted from his wings encompassed a volume of space measured in cubic yards, not the precise aim points that German pilots trained to achieve with their cannon armament. His first burst caught Mitusch's wingman's center mass. The heavy bullets tore through the Messerschmitt's thin aluminum skin and destroyed the engine in a cascade of metal fragments and glycol coolant. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, but its implications rippled through Luftwaffe command structures within hours. German pilots reported that American fighters were somehow climbing faster and higher than intelligence assessments indicated was even possible. More troubling still, the Thunderbolt seemed immune to the high-altitude performance degradation that plagued German aircraft above 28,000 feet. At Luftwaffe headquarters, General Adolf Galland studied combat reports with growing concern. His pilots described American fighters that could sustain vertical climbs at altitudes where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lost power and responsiveness. The reports seemed impossible, yet they came from experienced pilots whose competence could not be questioned. The mystery deepened when German technicians examined wreckage from downed Thunderbolts. The engines showed evidence of operating pressures far beyond what German engineers considered survivable. Boost readings etched into instrument faces indicated manifold pressures of 65 inches of mercury. Settings like that would have grenaded any DB605 or BMW 801 engine within minutes of application. The encounter that truly showcased the Thunderbolt's remarkable capabilities unfolded on March 12th, when Johnson found himself tangling with 2 Focke-Wulf 190As above Austin Brook. His aircraft took the full brunt of their cannon fire. A 20mm shell tore straight through his starboard wing, shredding hydraulic lines in its path. Fluid erupted across his canopy in a terrible spray as his control surfaces went sluggish and unresponsive. Yet somehow, impossibly, the massive fighter held its line with a stability that left the German pilots shaking their heads in disbelief. The German pilots, trained on the doctrine that solid hits meant immediate victory, pressed forward with their attack. Their amazement grew with each passing second as their target refused to tumble from the sky. Another burst of cannon fire raked across Johnson's engine cowling, the rounds punching through the oil cooler and sending thick black smoke billowing behind him. Any Messerschmitt Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf taking equivalent punishment would have been spiraling earthward in its final moments. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying, kept shooting back. Johnson's aircraft absorbed a staggering 212 puncture wounds before he finally broke contact and pointed his battered fighter toward home. His engine was running hot, oil pressure dancing wildly on the gauge while cylinder head temperatures climbed into dangerous territory. The hydraulic system had quit completely by the time he spotted the English coastline, leaving him to manually pump his landing gear down as he approached the field. He came in hard without flaps, but he came in alive. His landing gear held, the fuselage held. When ground crews examined the damage, they stood in stunned silence, counting each hole, each torn panel, each buckling in the metal skin. The mechanics who tore down that engine found damage that would have been absolutely catastrophic in any other fighter. Yet the double Wasp had kept turning. The word spread through intelligence channels in wildly different ways. American commanders saw confirmation that their investment in heavily armored, powerful fighters was vindicated. German analysts, meanwhile, faced a troubling question they couldn't quite answer. How could American aircraft absorb damage that would destroy every fighter in the entire Luftwaffe inventory and still limp home? The Thunderbolt's reputation began its remarkable shift. Where there had been derision, now came grudging respect. Where there had been dismissal, now came caution. The German pilots who'd once laughed at the bulky American fighters as simple prey now approached every encounter with gathering wariness. That flying milk bottle was proving itself capable of things German doctrine had never anticipated. By April of 1944, Thunderbolt squadrons were routinely operating above 30,000 feet, their supercharged engines maintaining full power at altitudes where German fighters gasped for breath. The transformation had completed itself. Mockery had become nightmare. When new orders arrived on June 7th, the day after the Normandy landings, everything changed direction completely. The Thunderbolts were reassigned. No longer would they serve exclusively as high-altitude escort fighters. Instead, they were about to become something the Luftwaffe had never encountered. Flying artillery, precision ground attack weapons with the firepower of field guns and the mobility of cavalry. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson studied the briefing photographs spread across the table at Boxted Airfield, examining German rail yards and supply depots scattered across the northern French landscape, all feeding the desperate German attempts to reinforce their collapsing defenses. Someone had realized something crucial. Those 850 caliber machine guns, originally designed purely for downing aircraft, possessed devastating destructive power against ground targets when delivered from diving attack runs. The tactical shift meant changing ammunition loads. Out went the standard rounds. In came armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary shells capable of tearing through locomotive boilers and tank armor like paper. Each Thunderbolt now carried 2,500 rounds distributed across all 8 guns, a mixture of armor-piercing, high-explosive, and standard ammunition. When concentrated in sustained bursts, this combination created patterns of destruction that German logistics officers found impossible to understand or counter. Johnson's first ground attack sortie came on June the 10th, targeting a railway marshalling yard near Chartres, where German supply trains gathered before heading toward Normandy. 4 Thunderbolts flew in at 300 feet, skimming across the French countryside in line abreast formation. Each pilot had selected different sections of the rail complex to concentrate destruction. Johnson nosed into a 30-degree dive, his airspeed climbing toward 400 miles per hour as the marshalling yard grew larger in his gun sight. At 800 yards, he squeezed the trigger. All 8 guns erupted simultaneously, and his aircraft bucked with the recoil. A locomotive exploded under the concentrated hammer blow of 50 caliber rounds, its boiler rupturing in a catastrophic steam explosion that derailed 3 freight cars behind it. Captain Fred Christensen, flying as wingman, targeted a fuel train on the adjacent track. His armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited the gasoline cars in a chain reaction that consumed 17 wagons and sent a pillar of black smoke climbing miles into the sky. The remaining 2 Thunderbolts methodically destroyed switching equipment, signal towers, and maintenance buildings until the entire yard lay useless to German operations. The results exceeded every projection Allied planners had made. Estimates had suggested Thunderbolt strafing runs might delay German supply movements by a few hours. Instead, single squadron attacks were obliterating entire transportation networks, creating logistical collapse that spread through German command structures across occupied France like ripples through water. Oberst Heinrich Müller, a German supply officer, experienced this catastrophe firsthand when his armored division's fuel convoy disappeared under a Thunderbolt attack near Falaise on June 18th. 8 P-47s emerged from the clouds and systematically destroyed 23 fuel trucks in a coordinated assault lasting less than 4 minutes. 200 tanks and assault guns came to a complete standstill, immobilized and helpless without gasoline. Among German ground forces, the Thunderbolt transformed from minor irritant into absolute terror within days of D-Day. Wehrmacht soldiers learned to recognize that distinctive growl of turbo-supercharged radial engines and immediately dove for whatever cover they could find. Unlike fighter bombers that delivered single bombs or rockets, these American fighters could strafe continuously for extended periods. Their massive ammunition loads meant sustained attacks that pinned entire units in place, unable to move, unable to fight back. Luftwaffe attempts to intercept these marauding fighters ended in consistent disaster. German fighters designed for high-altitude interception proved vulnerable to low-level combat, where Thunderbolt ruggedness and firepower created overwhelming advantages. Johnson demonstrated this reality near Cormeilles on June 22nd, when his formation encountered 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustavs attempting to strafe British positions. The German formation, led by Major Gerhard Barkhorn, had descended to 500 feet to attack armor when Johnson's Thunderbolts arrived from the northwest. Flying at treetop level, the Americans possessed energy and position advantages the Germans couldn't counter. Johnson's opening burst caught Barkhorn's wingman. The concentrated 50 caliber fire tore the fighter's port wing completely away from the fuselage. The Messerschmitt became uncontrollable wreckage, cartwheeling toward the ground. Barkhorn attempted to climb and recover tactical advantage, but his damaged aircraft couldn't match the Thunderbolt's low-altitude performance. Johnson pursued through a series of aggressive turns that would have been suicidal at altitude. His fighters' weight-to-power ratio, which German intelligence had insisted made turning combat impossible, actually provided sustained maneuverability that caught the German pilot completely off guard. Johnson's second burst found Barkhorn's engine coolant system, destroying it completely and forcing an emergency landing in a nearby wheat field. Barkhorn survived to be captured. His fighter joined the growing collection of Luftwaffe machines destroyed by American aircraft that German doctrine had proclaimed inferior in every combat parameter. Railway destruction accelerated as Thunderbolt squadrons refined their techniques. By month's end, Allied intelligence calculated that German supply capacity had plummeted by 60% across the entire Western Front. Locomotives, the irreplaceable heart of German logistics, were being destroyed faster than German factories could replace them. The human dimension mattered equally. German supply personnel, already exhausted after years of war, found themselves under relentless assault from aircraft they couldn't escape and couldn't fight. Morale disintegrated as train crews abandoned their posts rather than face certain death from Thunderbolts that appeared without warning and delivered firepower with devastating precision. General Adolf Galland, studying casualty reports at Luftwaffe headquarters, grasped the terrible implications. The Thunderbolt wasn't merely a tactical problem anymore, it represented strategic catastrophe. His fighter pilots, trained for aerial combat, were being methodically destroyed by American aircraft operating in conditions where German advantages in speed and maneuverability meant absolutely nothing. The numbers told an undeniable story. Thunderbolt squadrons were destroying an average of 12 locomotives daily across all operational zones while losing fewer than 2 aircraft weekly to all causes combined. German fighter losses against Thunderbolts had climbed to unsustainable levels, forcing the Luftwaffe to abandon daylight operations anywhere American ground attack fighters could reach. By July 1st, Wehrmacht commanders were urgently requesting immediate withdrawal from any positions reachable by Thunderbolt attacks. The psychological terror created by those 8 machine guns had established a zone of control extending far beyond where the planes actually flew, paralyzing German tactical decision-making across hundreds of square miles. The transformation was absolute. What German pilots had derided as a flying milk bottle had become the instrument of their defeat, delivering firepower no amount of skill could overcome and absorbing damage no German fighter could survive. The final German gamble arrived on December 16, 1944, when 3 German army groups launched Operation Autumn Mist through the snow-covered Ardennes. For 3 days, winter weather kept Allied aircraft grounded while German forces surged toward Antwerp, hoping to split the American and British armies and force negotiations. General Adolf Galland had persuaded Hitler that temporary air superiority, achieved by concentrating every remaining Luftwaffe fighter, might provide the decisive advantage. Johnson watched from Boxted Airfield as weather reports confirmed zero visibility across the battle zone. His squadron and hundreds of others sat earthbound while German armor advanced deeper into Allied territory. Radio intercepts revealed the offensive's massive scale, over 200,000 troops supported by nearly 1,000 tanks pushing forward under weather protection that neutralized American air power. The weather cleared on December 22nd. Johnson led his squadron into brilliant winter sunshine above Belgium, where the full scope of German commitment became immediately apparent. Entire Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions stretched across the landscape below, their vehicles forming endless columns snaking through valleys and across frozen rivers. German commanders had staked everything on this offensive, gathering forces representing the Reich's last mobile reserves. The Thunderbolt response was swift and overwhelming. Johnson's 8 machine guns acquired their first target in a column of Panzer IVs moving through a forest clearing near Bastogne. The roar of 12,000 feet met the diving Thunderbolt with a violence that shook the fuselage. Airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour as the pilot drove downward through hostile skies, transforming potential energy into kinetic fury that transformed armor-piercing rounds into unstoppable projectiles. German tank armor, designed to withstand conventional threats, proved useless against the devastating convergence of velocity and firepower. The lead vehicles erupted in a torrent of flame and metal, their destruction triggering a chain reaction that engulfed 3 more tanks in sequence. That single pass created an impassable barrier across the road, trapping the entire column in a coffin of twisted steel and burning fuel. Across the Ardennes landscape, the same violent drama repeated itself endlessly as hundreds of Thunderbolts materialized from above, catching German formations bunched together and helpless in the open terrain. The Wehrmacht's strategic doctrine had been constructed on assumptions that no longer held true. Rapid armored advances, supposedly backed by air superiority, had seemed invincible on paper, but reality had shattered those calculations with brutal efficiency. German commanders discovered communications networks severed by deliberate attacks, supply routes obliterated by sustained bombing runs, and armor columns left stranded when infantry support vanished into the fog of air superiority lost. Major Gerhard Barkhorn now led what remained of Jagdgeschwader 52, commanding 60 Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustavs in a desperate thrust to establish protective cover above the ground forces below. His pilots were the last experienced fighter crews the Luftwaffe possessed, survivors of years spent battling overwhelming odds over the Eastern Front and beyond. They climbed steadily toward 30,000 feet, seeking that critical altitude advantage that might somehow compensate for the numerical advantage their American opponents held. Johnson's formation intercepted the German fighters above the Meuse River, and the collision began with terrible inevitability. The altitude worked against the Germans immediately. The Thunderbolt's supercharged engine maintained full power in the thin air above 30,000 feet, while the Messerschmitts gasped for performance in conditions that left them gasping. The opening attack came head-on, a calculated pass that displayed the raw firepower advantage that American fighters possessed. 8 machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc created a devastating cone of projectiles that no German pilot could fly through without instant death. The violent maneuver forced immediate evasive action that surrendered all tactical initiative to the Americans. Combat devolved into a pattern the Germans could not counter. Vertical engagements where Thunderbolts climbed away from disadvantageous positions with a performance advantage that left the Messerschmitts unable to respond. Barkhorn watched his dream evaporate through binoculars. These experienced pilots, men who had survived brutal air campaigns over Russia and Poland, were being methodically destroyed by American aircraft that could outclimb, outgun, and outlast anything the Luftwaffe possessed. Within 30 minutes, Barkhorn had lost 42 fighters to Johnson's 24 Thunderbolts. The exchange rate approached 2-1 in favor of the Americans, a ratio that German training doctrine had never prepared them to address. That mathematical reality made no sense within the strategic framework German air doctrine had been built upon. The Luftwaffe had assumed that experienced pilots flying superior aircraft would inevitably defeat numerically superior but technically inferior opponents. The Thunderbolt shattered every premise that assumption rested on. The destruction extended far beyond air combat. Thunderbolt squadrons operating at low altitude discovered that German supply columns stretched across hundreds of miles of Belgian countryside, created target opportunities that maximized the devastating effectiveness of sustained machine gun attacks. Johnson's second mission that day took him to a fuel convoy near Huffelise, where 60 tanker trucks sat immobilized in traffic created by destroyed bridges and cratered roads. The attack consumed 18 minutes and expended over half of Johnson's ammunition supply. Yet the results far exceeded anything the tactical manuals had predicted for close air support. Every tanker truck was destroyed along with its escort vehicles and the anti-aircraft batteries that attempted to defend the convoy. The explosions created a smoke column visible from 30 miles away and erased fuel reserves intended for an entire panzer division. German ground commanders, already struggling with severed communications, found themselves commanding units that existed only on their tactical maps, while American fighters had annihilated them hours earlier. Staff officers reported unit positions and strengths that bore no relationship to the actual battlefield anymore, creating a paralysis in command and control that spread through the entire offensive structure. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. German soldiers who had advanced confidently through fog and snow now cowered in foxholes whenever they heard aircraft engines approaching. That distinctive sound of turbo-supercharged radials became synonymous with death descending from above, terror that transcended rational military assessment. Entire companies abandoned their positions rather than face Thunderbolt strafing attacks that materialized without warning. By December 28th, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed beneath sustained air attacks that German planning had never anticipated or prepared against. Losses exceeded 60,000 casualties and 800 tanks, while Thunderbolt squadrons reported destroying over 2,000 vehicles and locomotives during 6 days of uninterrupted operations. The exchange rates now favored the Americans by such overwhelming margins that continued German resistance became strategically impossible. Goering's final gamble had failed catastrophically. The Luftwaffe entered 1945 with fewer than 300 operational fighters, most piloted by inexperienced pilots whose survival was measured in hours rather than months. American Thunderbolt squadrons had achieved numerical and qualitative superiority that no remaining German air assets could possibly challenge. Johnson's personal victory tally reached 28 confirmed kills during the Battle of the Bulge, establishing him as one of the leading American aces of the European theater. More importantly, his squadron had proven that Thunderbolts could operate continuously in the close air support role while maintaining air superiority against any German opposition the enemy could field. The transformation was complete. The aircraft, once ridiculed as a flying milk bottle, had become master of European skies. The Reich's last mobile reserves lay scattered across Belgian forests, silent testimony to firepower that German military science had dismissed as impossible. 50-caliber machine guns synchronized through a single propeller arc delivered destruction that no amount of tactical skill or strategic planning could overcome. The silence at Boxted Airfield on May 8, 1945, carried a weight that celebration could never lift. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson stood beside his Thunderbolt, running his hand across bullet holes patched with aluminum plates and rivets, each repair marking another encounter where those 50-caliber guns had proven decisive. The aircraft bore the accumulated damage of 2 years in combat. Over 400 documented hits from cannon shells, machine gun bullets, and shrapnel fragments that would have destroyed lighter fighters instantly. Johnson's logbook recorded 378 combat missions, 28 confirmed aerial victories, and the destruction of 147 ground targets ranging from locomotives to Tiger tanks. The numbers represented mathematical precision applied to warfare, each statistic validated by gun camera footage that documented the Thunderbolt's transformation from ridiculed aircraft to the most feared fighter in European skies. Across Germany, Luftwaffe airfields lay abandoned, their runways cratered by bombs and littered with wreckage from aircraft that had challenged American air superiority and lost. General Adolf Galland, now a prisoner awaiting interrogation, reflected on decisions that had seemed reasonable in 1943, but proved catastrophically wrong by 1945. His dismissal of the Thunderbolt as an inferior design had cost the Luftwaffe over 3,000 fighters and the lives of Germany's most experienced pilots. The final tally revealed the scope of Thunderbolt dominance with precision that astonished both Allied and German analysts. P-47 squadrons had destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing 943 Thunderbolts to all causes, creating an exchange ratio of 4-to-1 that exceeded every pre-war prediction for fighter effectiveness. More significantly, Thunderbolt ground attacks had destroyed over 12,000 locomotives, 37,000 vehicles, and an estimated 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles. These numbers represented more than tactical success. They documented the complete collapse of German logistics and mobility that made continued resistance strategically impossible. Commanders who had planned operations based on railway schedules found their transportation networks systematically destroyed by aircraft they had initially dismissed as obsolete. Supply officers who had calculated fuel consumption for armored divisions discovered their tanker convoys obliterated by machine gun fire that could penetrate armor plate from distances exceeding 1,000 yards. Johnson walked through the squadron ready room where photographs covered every wall surface, images of destroyed German aircraft, burning railway yards, and exploding supply convoys that documented the Thunderbolt's evolution from escort fighter to ground attack specialist. Each photograph represented tactical innovations developed through combat experience rather than theoretical planning. The transformation had required fundamental changes in pilot training, maintenance procedures, and tactical doctrine. American pilots learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's unique combination of high-altitude performance and low-level ruggedness, creating combat techniques that German pilots could not counter with existing aircraft or training. Mechanics developed field modifications that enhanced engine performance, improved armor protection, and increased ammunition capacity beyond factory specifications. The Thunderbolt demonstrated that American industrial philosophy could produce military equipment superior to anything German engineering created, despite widespread assumptions about Teutonic technical superiority. The massive radial engine, complex turbo-supercharger system, and heavy machine gun armament represented approaches to fighter design that European manufacturers had rejected as impractical or impossible. Republic Aircraft Corporation's production statistics told the story of American manufacturing capability that German planners had consistently underestimated. 15,683 Thunderbolts had been manufactured in less than 4 years, each aircraft representing over 40,000 individual components assembled with precision that maintained performance standards throughout the production run. German fighter production had declined steadily after 1943 as Allied bombing disrupted manufacturing and raw material supplies dwindled. The human cost of Thunderbolt's success extended beyond German casualties. American pilots developed emotional attachments to aircraft that brought them home despite damage that would have been fatal in lighter designs. Johnson's maintenance crew chief, Technical Sergeant William Murphy, had counted over 800 individual repairs to Johnson's aircraft during 2 years of combat. Each patch represented a moment when superior engineering had preserved human life. These emotional bonds created veteran pilot communities that persisted long after the war ended. Thunderbolt pilots developed shared understanding of their aircraft's capabilities that transcended normal military relationships between pilot and machine. They spoke of their fighters with affection reserved for living companions, crediting designers with saving their lives through superior metallurgy, redundant systems, and structural strength. The strategic implications of Thunderbolt effectiveness reached beyond tactical success to demonstrate American capacity for technological innovation under wartime pressure. The aircraft's evolution incorporated thousands of improvements suggested by combat pilots and implemented by engineers and manufacturers who could respond to changing requirements with unprecedented speed. German post-war analysis, conducted by surviving Luftwaffe officers under Allied supervision, revealed the scope of tactical miscalculations that had cost Germany air superiority. Luftwaffe intelligence had consistently underestimated American aircraft performance, pilot training standards, and industrial production capacity, creating strategic blind spots that proved fatal to German war aims. Johnson's final mission report, submitted on May 7th, documented the destruction of 6 German aircraft on the ground at an abandoned airfield near Munich, bringing his personal victory total to 34 confirmed kills. The aircraft represented the last operational fighters available to the Luftwaffe in the European theatre, marking the end of organized German air resistance after nearly 6 years of warfare. The Thunderbolt's legacy extended beyond statistical achievements to encompass fundamental changes in military aviation that influenced aircraft design for decades. The concept of heavily armed, heavily armored fighters capable of multiple mission profiles became standard doctrine for air forces worldwide, validating design philosophy German engineers had dismissed as primitive or wasteful. Standing beside his battle-scarred fighter as sunset painted the English countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Johnson understood he had witnessed warfare itself transform. The age of individual combat between pilots had ended, replaced by industrial conflict where superior technology, manufacturing capacity, and tactical innovation determined victory. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as a flying milk bottle, had become the instrument that delivered American air power to German skies with precision and overwhelming force that no amount of courage or skill could overcome.